then I'm the host of the World Pastoralist Forum, a social media group that's hosting this dialogue today. This dialogue basically is going to focus on climate and livestock productivity in the pastoral areas. Why this dialogue is happening is because of a generated discussion about resilience and climate change from a pastoralist perspective. And so we bring you as panelists of your experience, the knowledge, and the level of practice you have gone through in terms of understanding climate change, livestock systems, and policy practice. And so we aim at giving people a platform as a pastoralist forum. We give you a platform to share your knowledge, to bridge the gap between pastoralism, policy, and timing. So as we open up this, I and my colleagues, Evans and Hero, will be taking you through the discussion, and we shall be able to moderate and provide a platform with due respect on different topics and different questions and answers from participants. We will be helping to moderate and also collect the questions and suggestions from the participants who will be following. With due respect, we expect maximum respect to each and everyone's opinion, views, and also knowledge. If one has a view about pastoralism as it's already receiving a lot of misconceptions, we'll need to respect that view, but have it corrected and we move forward. For this discussion, I request that my colleague Ivan and Ido take it through the moderation. Thank you so much. You're most welcome. Have a lively discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lupa, for that very nice introduction. I just want to briefly talk about the format of the webinar, but first I should say who I am. So my name is Evan Griffith. I'm a PhD candidate at Tufts University, and I'm a member of the World Pastoralist Forum and one of the planning committee for this event. So I'm really excited to have everyone here. So in terms of the structure, we're going to have one panel in the first hour. The panel is going to be an hour long, and each speaker will have around 7 minutes to give a brief presentation on the topic. And when there's 1 minute left, Ariel is just going to use the raise hand emoji just to give you a heads up. And then after we're done with the 7-minute presentations, each one of the panelists is going to have the opportunity to ask one question to the other panelists. And then we'll open it up for around 15 minutes of question and answer, which my colleague Wahid is going to be helping moderate in the chat. So please put all your questions and answers in the chat. And as Lupa said, just to reiterate, this is an exciting opportunity to learn something, and we're all here together, and it's going to be a respectful and positive environment. So to start, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Tara Garnett, who's the director of Table at the University of Oxford. Dr. Garnett's work centers on the interactions among food, climate, health, and broader sustainability issues. So if you can start us off, Doctor, thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. I'm just pressing it onto reading mode. So thank you. 7 minutes is not very long, so I'm going to be as brief as I can in my self-introduction. I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford. I look at food systems and their intersection with a wide range of sustainability concerns. And I also run an entity called Table. That's the website address is just there. So that's me. What I want to do with this presentation, and I need to preface it with the most important comment that I am talking at a global general aggregate level. So I'm not talking about local context and local specificity that I'm sure will come up in the discussion. So I'm going to address two questions and then pose a question to the audience. So the first is, what do we know about the role of grazing livestock in the greenhouse gas balance? The second is, why is there so much focus on the need for dietary shift? And the third is, I guess, a request to try and for us all to work together to overcome polarization in debates around livestock. So I was involved in a study a few years ago called Grazed and Confused, which tried to understand the role of grazing ruminants in the net greenhouse gas balance. It asked questions about carbon emissions, about soil carbon sequestration, the role of methane, and the role of nitrogen, as well as some of the dynamics of land use change. It didn't address all the other really important questions around the role of grazing livestock in lots and lots of other areas, both for good and for bad. What our study came up with, and I have to be very quick, was having assessed the evidence, we looked at the peer review evidence and found that sequestration would offset about 20 to 60% of grazing emissions, 4 to 11% of overall livestock emissions, ruminant, monogastric, intensive, extensive, and then a tiny fraction of total global emissions. So the potential itself is not enormous, which isn't to say that it's not useful. There's been more recent work, so that was in 2019. This study last year really looked at global greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants and then looked at the grassland carbon stock across a range of different regions, and then looked at, so that stock is in yellow, and on the left is I think it's wait, I can't, yes, on the left it's the total, on the right it's tons per hectare. And what you can see, the green is relevant, is the required sequestration from livestock, from ruminant livestock, to offset their emissions and make those grasslands carbon neutral. Another study which looked at the role of grazing animals in the net greenhouse gas balance, and it came to the conclusion that grasslands populated with domesticated ruminants, so in human grazing systems, were a net contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but wild ruminants in sparsely managed areas were part of it, were net sinks. So it balanced out as almost neutral, but it also showed that the trends over time are towards slight warming because of the growth in grazing livestock numbers. So again, if the difference between wild and domesticated is, among other things, a difference in animal numbers and management approaches. And then another recent overall review came up with the points that are basically not new, that the more degraded the soil, the more carbon it will sequester. This process plateaus over time. There's massive variation in soils and their capacity to sequester carbon, which makes it so very hard and erroneous to extrapolate from one particular study. There's been a lot of focus on the mob grazing, holistic grazing, those sorts of terms. The evidence is really patchy. There needs to be a lot more research. There are some positive signs, but again, the sequestration is never going to be like massive and like, planet saving. Importantly, carbon can be lost from soils and gains reversed. And the same answer comes up again and again. The same most important thing is to keep existing carbon in the ground, not plough it up, not deforest further. And so another point that I want to make, so the second point is why the focus on diets. And that is because if you look at the 1.5 degree limit, and if you look at projected trends in food related emissions, that's the black bar, you can see that the emissions by 2100 from the food sector as a whole are going to gobble up the entirety of our 2 degrees limit. So that leaves no emission space for housing, transport, organizing Zoom calls, anything. Everything is going to be taken up by food, and that's the 2 degree limit, and we're actually aiming for a 1.5 degree limit. So my colleagues at Oxford modelled a whole range of different approaches for getting food-related emissions down. And basically what they found is that you need to throw everything at it, but that the dietary change, so towards plant-rich diets, is not an optional thing. It's got to be part of a package of measures to reduce food-related emissions. And there have also been lots and lots of studies which try and look at what a diet that sits within planetary boundaries and that nourishes a people effectively might look like. The most famous or maybe notorious of these is the Eat Lancet report, which comes up with quite a dramatic configuration of diets in an affluent country such as the UK, where I'm coming from, a very, very major reduction in animal products. But if you look at it from a more global perspective, you will see that this contraction and convergence approach, this fair shares approach, would actually give rise to an increase in animal product consumption in some parts of the world. So we need to be heading towards this, this more equitable global approach. I just wanted to also include this slide, which looks at the role of grass-only systems in the protein supply. So as you can see, crops are the major source of protein at an aggregate level in people's diets, and grazing only supplies, again, at a global level, very little. But that general picture masks the need to recognise the localized importance of grazing animals to food security, but also its role in many other areas. So again, it's this global versus local perspective. So my conclusions very quickly, I don't know how I'm doing for time, that current aggregate trends in meat and dairy of all kinds in all systems are just not sustainable. We need to shift away from a dependence on meat and dairy in our diets. This is absolutely true in high-income countries, but also increasingly for many people in low and middle-income countries. The situation for least developed countries is completely different. Different systems engender different problems. So it's not that intensive is good and extensive is bad, or the other way around. And that if we were to shift to a global grass-fed scenario while also maintaining current high-income consumption patterns, that would be devastating for the planet because of land use change and deforestation. We need to work with both top-down and bottom-up perspectives on the issues around livestock. There is this local specificity, but we also need to bear the global context and the global imperative to tackle climate change in mind. That the greater integration of cropping and livestock systems in many parts of the world will be very important. It's been separated and specialized in the name of progress, and to feeding animals simply on byproducts. But the amount of meat you get out of that will be, again, significantly lower than what is the case in high-income countries. And my plea and my question for this discussion is, how can we reduce polarization in debates around livestock? I don't have the answer, but I'd like to work with people to work on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garnett. And I think that's a great question that we can maybe start off our question and answer session with. So I'm really looking forward to discussing that further. So the next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Bernard Kumaro, who's the head of the Climate Change and Livestock Sustainability section at the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development in Kenya.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Bernard Kimoro, as introduced. I work in the State Department for Livestock Development in the Ministry of Agriculture. I'm not a doctor yet. I think there was a small mistake on the poster, but nevertheless, I'm very glad to be here. I'm also going to share my presentation, a very brief one. I realize 7 minutes is a very short time to have any kind of presentation, but it looks like I'm disabled from the sharing part. So if I could be allowed to share.
Sure. 1 second, Bernard, I'm just gonna set you up to share.
It should work now.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes. I think it is there. Let's see. So my topic today is really talking about using what they call Tier 2 methodology of classification of GHG emissions for other livestock. I think the previous speaker has been very clear about the focus, which is mainly the pastoral regions and the rangelands. So I just wanted to briefly just talk about, when you talk about issues around emissions, sorry, I'm having a challenge in moving my slide. Oh yeah, there we are. Yeah. So when you're talking about emissions for other livestock, basically we are looking at emissions from extensive systems. So I also wanted to be a bit broad in terms of the presentation, but also give some examples of what we have in Kenya. Yeah, I think it has already been mentioned previously. Livestock are very, very important. Globally, I think 40% of the agricultural value chains and output is from livestock. Enormous numbers of people depend on livestock, 1.3 billion, 800 million smallholders depend on that particular sector. But specifically in terms of livestock in the pastoral regions, we have about 500 million pastoralists who rely on livestock. Of course, it has been mentioned for food, the income, of course, the insurance, I think it was mentioned earlier, safety nets, and also, you know, when there are emergencies, they also applied. Of course, there is a big debate. Livestock is seen as a culprit in terms of emissions. Generally, from the livestock production activities, we talk about 14.5% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gases are emitted from livestock value chains. So the focus and the talk recently has been, how do we make our livestock supply chains more efficient so that we are able to reduce emissions. There is the thinking about emissions intensity reduction, which means reducing the amount of emissions per product that you're producing. If it is a kilo of milk, can we reduce the emissions that are being produced from that kilo of milk? The big challenge as we think about increasing efficiency is that there's still very inadequate understanding of the level of these emissions. Yeah, it's very clear from intensive systems, very well structured. You can get data, we can quantify those emissions, but it's not so clear when you go into extensive systems where these other livestock are situated. So for today, I think when you talk about other livestock, there is IPCC classification of livestock. So we have different categories. Of course, dairy is very clear. When you talk about dairy, we are looking at an animal that gives substantial amounts of milk. And part of that, which is normally goes to commercial use for income generation. For other livestock, IPCC classifies them into different categories. We have the non-dairy cattle. In some other areas, they may call them the beef animals, especially in the extensive systems, and also intensive like feedlot systems. Also, those are non-dairy cattle. You also have the sheep, the goats, especially the ones that are for meat, camels, and I said any other, because It's not limited, because in other parts of the world, we have the buffaloes, for example, in India. Those are different. It could be classified as dairy, part of the dairy, or if they're not dairy, then the other types of animals. We also have in South America, for example, different kinds of livestock categories. Yeah, so the current narrative is that most of the emissions from livestock are actually from extensive and inefficient systems. And these are mainly from the other livestock that we have just talked about. Yeah, so that is the narrative that is out there, that the emissions levels, especially in other from other livestock, are actually rising, and that is what is giving rise to the emissions in the agricultural sector. And therefore, this then brings about the fact that the only way to reduce some of these emissions is to reduce the livestock numbers in extensive systems. Yeah, so people are talking about, can we reduce the number of, for example, cattle in the rangelands, in the pastoral systems, sheep and goats and all that. Yeah. So in terms of investments, we realize that, yeah, this is also being affected because the financing, technology development and transfer, and also capacity building that usually comes from, for example, the Green Climate Fund, is focusing more on the efficient systems, yeah, like the intensive dairy, which are already very well structured. We know where to address, including feed additives. But for the extensive systems, we still don't have enough investment in that. Okay, so for the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 in emission quantification is very, very simple. Yeah, and I've given a few figures there to be able to show. For Tier 1, when you're quantifying the emissions, what we normally do is to take the population or the livestock numbers, and then we multiply by the what we call the default emission factors, which are provided by the IPCC. So it's quite easy. So you take the numbers, quantify using the default emission factor. But if you're looking at Tier 2, for example, then we go into having the different livestock categories and then breaking them down further. We'll see shortly what we did in Kenya. So you have your livestock population, but then again, you want to break it down. Can I break it down by the livestock production system, which is there? Then we now use what we call the animal performance data. It could be the intake, it could be the weight, and all that. Yeah. So for Kenya, what we realized, and this is general, is that when you go into Tier 2 methods, which is shown previously, you really need a lot of capacity to be in place. Yeah. So for iterating or moving to Tier 2 methods in other livestock, as opposed to dairy, which is very structured, as I said, you need to have better institutional capacity, which means you need to have more collaboration between the different sectors or even the different disciplines. Animals in extensive systems are within rangelands. We have colleagues who are in wildlife who are there. We have experts who are actually able to look at the livestock production systems. So it is very important to have a lot of institutional capacity. Of course, you may need to have a core team that is doing the exercise and a standard operating procedure for that whole process. It requires more data, and this data has to be reliable. It has to be published. If we are talking about administrative or official data, it has to be available. It could be from national census, but sometimes you also have to apply what you call the expert judgment to be able to get the data for quantification of the emissions. Yeah, so this is what I said about the inventory structure. For Kenya, for example,
Mr. Bernard, sorry, I think you have to please wrap up. Sorry.
Yeah,
Almost
okay.
10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just about to finish. Yeah, so for Kenya, for the cattle or non-dairy cattle, we categorized or we broke them down again into the different production systems. And within the production systems, then we categorized into the herd structure. So that is what is meant for Tier 2. Same for sheep, and that is what we actually were able to find out. So for Tier 1, very easy. If you want to reduce emissions, reduce livestock numbers. Yeah. And if you have your emissions, your projections are very not very clear. And your programs, if you have projects or programs, it's not very, you're not very sure about reducing your emission levels. Yeah. So I just wanted to give an example for Kenya again, where you see National Inventory Report (NIR) that we use Tier 1 and Tier 2 for cattle. The one on the left is for cattle. You can see emission levels actually went up for cattle. But if you look at the sheep and goats, emission levels actually declined. So it means as you use a higher tire, you have more accurate estimates. I don't have to talk about this, but what it means is that from the emission levels, then you can have observations, say, this could be as a result of, for example, the range condition declining, and you can have a policy intervention from there. So in conclusion, is that Tier 2 methods are more accurate. It reduces the inaccuracies that may be there in Tier 1, and therefore it gives better estimates. However, it is not necessarily going to lead to lower emission levels, and we saw that in the Kenyan case. Using higher tire like Tier 2 also is better in terms of policy levers. You are able to target the source of the highest emissions, whether it is the actual hard structure, whether it is the feeding, then you're able to target that, and you have a clear policy guideline. I think that is the end of the presentation, but the big question is how can we be able to spread the capacity in terms of quantification of emissions, and how does this inform the policy in terms of other livestock? Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for that really fascinating presentation about the Tier 2. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Ilse Kohler-Rollason. It's a pleasure to have you here, Doctor. So Ilse is the author of Hoofprints on the Land and co-founder of Camel Charisma. And she works towards policies and practices that support socially responsible and ecologically sustainable livestock development. So we're very excited to hear from you. And just as a reminder to all the panelists, once you see the raised hand from Ariel, that means you have 1 minute left on your time. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me here in this exciting panel. Good evening. So I'm from the League for Pastoral Peoples, and we've been working on the ground with pastoralists, mostly in India, but also elsewhere and at the UN level for more than 30 years. And in this period, we have realized that pastoralists operate according to totally different principles than conventional sedentary animal keepers, which are usually considered the default model. So the pastoralist strategy is to deploy livestock to make optimal use of the plant biomass, be it natural vegetation or crop aftermath that is not grown as feed. And this implementation of this strategy, it needs two prerequisites. One of them is animals that are able to walk over long distances to seek out forage on their own initiative, that can thrive on whatever grows in a particular region, and also can slow down their metabolism to cope with droughts. The second prerequisite is a close relationship, a relationship of mutual trust between animals and herders, and the ability of both parties to communicate and understand each other across species boundaries. So this is what I want to emphasize. Pastoralists utilize what nature provides or what farmers have left over and would otherwise go to waste. Since they do not grow any feed for their animals, and their animals walk to their forage, their system is basically solar powered. It is fossil fuel free. It leaves the carbon in the ground, doesn't add any CO2 to the atmosphere, and it does not generally negatively impact biodiversity. It might affect biodiversity, but it doesn't really affect it negatively like crop cultivation does. A farmer replaces native vegetation with a monoculture and then uses chemicals and chemical fertilizer and pesticides, etc. Pastoralists do not do that. So this is a huge environmental benefit. And it's exactly the most natural way of food production that exists. And I want that to sink in because it's of enormous relevance at a junction when the need to reduce emissions from agriculture has been agreed upon as a priority during the COP28 in Dubai. And in FAO's own words, we need agri-food system solutions that build resilience, adapt to climate change, and reduce emissions while safeguarding biodiversity and ensuring food security for all. And no other agri-food system fits this description as well. Of course, ruminant livestock, be it sheep, goats, cattle, camels, the South American camelids, yaks, buffaloes, even reindeer, they all do emit methane. But so do giraffes, elephants, buffaloes, and the many antelopes that roam around Africa's savanna or their relatives on Asian steppes. As our colleague Pablo Manzano has pointed out, if we remove livestock from grasslands and drylands, wild ruminants and termites would move into the vacated space, making this basically a zero-sum game in terms of methane emissions. I highly respect African countries' willingness to do their share in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and in signing on to the global methane pledge, although their contribution to global warming has been minuscule compared to that of the global north. I also understand that by reducing methane quickly, it is easier to reach certain climate goals as staying with the 1.5 degree target. But in the long run, it's the use of fossil fuels that we need to reduce, because CO2 remains in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, practically indefinitely, while methane is short-lived and breaks down after 12 years. Now I would like to comment on some of the strategies that have been suggested to reduce methane emissions of livestock. These interventions include better feed, meaning more concentrate, better breeds, such as animals that have higher yields, better healthcare to eliminate losses, and also the use of methane inhibitors as well as tannin-rich food. While better healthcare is a priority of pastoralists and very much required anyway, so-called better breeds with higher performance are more susceptible to drought. And in Kenya, for instance, you have the case of the red Maasai, which is very drought resistant, versus the Dorper sheep, which is more productive, efficient, but succumbs much quicker in droughts. If we introduce better feed, I concentrate, this would inevitably be grown with fossil fuels, so increase CO2 emissions. Both better breeds and better feed will reduce the amount of methane emitted per unit of product, but not absolutely and from a systems perspective. And if we want to achieve a livestock sector that is sustainable, we need to apply a systems perspective. For too long, the sector and most of the science has just taken a very reductionist approach of maximizing efficiency in terms of food output versus feed input, and in using GHG emissions per unit of product as yardstick for environmental impact. If we apply this lens, the industrial systems of the global north come out on top. But at the same time, their disastrous effects on biodiversity, soil, water, air pollution, as well as animal welfare are ignored and left out of the calculations. In times when the livestock sector is a prime culprit in exceeding several planetary boundaries, this is not good enough. We need a different paradigm for livestock development that takes biodiversity, animal welfare, and pollution into account. If we develop such a new paradigm or accounting system that takes all these factors in account, then pastoralism undoubtedly will win. In India, the greenhouse gas emissions of pastoralist livestock per kilo of meat or milk may be high, relatively high. But if we look at the whole system, then we get a different result. For the most important and valuable product of Indian pastoralists is the organic manure that they directly deposit on farmers' fields, saving the country billions of dollars that would otherwise have to be spent on chemical fertilizer and the atmosphere a huge amount of greenhouse gases. Yes, one more minute. As 2024 is the International Year of Camelids, we must mention these animals that are one of the best options for adopting to global heating and more frequent droughts. Local people in East Africa, West Africa, and even Mongolia know this, and over the last 3 decades, many previously cattle-keeping communities have switched to camels and thereby improved their drought resilience. Scientifically, camels have been neglected, and currently research is led by oil-rich countries whose needs are entirely different from us in Africa and Asia, as their camels are prestige objects used for racing and beauty contests. We need camel research that addresses the needs of pastoralists in Africa and Asia. I therefore appeal to the participants in our dialogue to take note of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciate how you sort of illuminated the pastoral way of life, and yeah, it was just a wonderful talk. Thank you. So finally, we're going to wrap up our first panel with Josephette Masanja, who is a pastoralist from Tanzania and the East African coordinator of the Africa Youth Pastoralist Initiative. So welcome and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, moderator, for this opportunity. I'm so happy to be part of panelists. Definitely, I will go direct to my contribution. As we have seen in many countries, fossil fuel contribute to climate change. Agriculture also has been part of conversation in Africa, particularly cattle, which is actually also causing to climate change issues, but also it is somehow affected by climate changes. My colleague from Kenya also extrapolated a little bit. So Africa is the home of 382 million cattle, but also 506 million head of goats and 419 million heads of sheep. Ethiopia have been a very leading country in terms of population of cattle, with approximately 67.96 million heads of cattle, followed by my beloved country, Tanzania, with approximately 40 million heads of cattle. Same to Chad, with around 38 million cattle, which is actually followed by Kenya with approximately 35 million head of cattle. Although climate change have been downtrodden this potential for African pastoral communities with a very huge loss every year. For instance, in Kenya last year, they lost approximately 4.5 million cattle because of drought. Same to Tanzania, we lost around 5.6 million cattle because of the same problem. Ethiopia also lost the same number of cattle. So the youth perspective on this challenge is very clear, as this problem has been causing economic pressure due to loss of livestock, reduced income, and limited job opportunity, which actually create a very huge problem of job opportunity in Africa. And of course, we have seen this problem exacerbated in these 3 countries, Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. But also, climate change has been threatening traditional practice in pastoral community. We have seen many pastoral communities became disconnected because of nomadic. They move from one place to another, looking for resources such as fasting water, and actually become downtrodden in terms of their cultural heritage and cultural practices. To create resilience, as we young people and our organization, of course, African Youth Pastoralist Initiative, we have been working together with different partners, including International Livestock Research Institute, to initiate various initiatives which is significant to address these challenges. Before we started to implement any initiatives, we decided to conduct research, survey in pastoral community. For example, in Tanzania, the pastoral society is located in northern part of Tanzania, but also in Kenya is located in Laikipia, Somali County, and many other counties. So we did a little bit survey to see the potential impact of climate change, but also the animal production system, which is done in a pastoral community, and its impact in causing environmental implication, and of course, climate change. We found that a very large part of the pastoral land is turning into deserts. And of course, it was caused by overgrazing. But a very wonderful enough, we found that many pastoralists had no idea on how to solve this challenge. We tried also to reach out policymakers. We found that they have just one solution to apply, which is to reduce the number of heads in this society. Of course, we tried to initiate some kind of research innovations to see the root cause of this problem in order to come up with proper method of addressing this challenge. We found that the problem is not stocking rates, but the problem is the inch of land. Why? Because stocking rates has no basis of science. It has just based on our belief, because the only thing that causes overgrazing in this society is how many days these cattle are exposed to grazing in a given particular area, and how many days does the plant get time to recover. We found that one pastoralist owns approximately 2.5 acres, and one pastoralist can own even 100 numbers of cattle. So you can see the proportion between number of cattle and the area which is used to feed these animals. So we found that the biggest problem is land issues. And of course, we found in many pastoral communities, there is an existing conflict between a pastoral community and the sedentary agricultural communities. We tried to cross-check what happened before. We found that many pastoral people lost their land because of land encroachment done by weather governments in the name of wildlife land conservation. So that contributed much into this problem of overgrazing, because they started feeding their animal in a very small piece of land, while without applying any initiatives like rotation grazing or a holistic approach for making this land sustainable to feed their animals. But another thing we actually saw that 100% of our African pastoral community, they fed their animal with forage and pasture, which is significantly store carbon. And we have seen that pasture has a very significant role to store carbon in the root system, but also it has a very potential to mitigate the issue of carbon emissions. So this also applied a very significant problem of carbon footprint in these areas. And we have seen there is a very high temperature in this area. For instance, if you come to Tanzania or if you go to Laikipia in Kenya, there is a very high temperature in pastoral areas compared to sedentary agricultural communities like southern part of our country. So we said the only initiatives that we can apply first is to deal with land injustice, which is actually compromising the effort of these pastoral people to fight against climate change. We started negotiating with governments to see whether these people will be given land and also to change the legal framework for land issues, including the issue of land ownership system. Of course, we have solved some cases of land conflict in most of pastoral areas, which has significantly improved the effort of these people to fight against climate issues. But second, we initiated the idea of using forest trees, to plant forest trees in the land which absolutely turned into desert, to restore this land. And of course, we selected forest trees, which is also fed by animals. For example, we have
Mr.
Lucina
Joseph.
leucocephala.
Sorry, Mr. Joseph, please
Yes.
wrap up now. Sorry, we went over time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm finalizing. Definitely we send some tree, for example, Lucina leucocephala, Sespanian sespan, which has actually supported this community to get alternative source of feeding their animal. And of course, we are applying some initiatives like supplying them with animal supplement feeds to diversify the issue of feed insecurity in these areas, which is also presented a very good segment in terms of production and the effort of climate resilience. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that really great perspective on some issues that are going on in Tanzania, and not just, you know, what the impact of climate change is on pastoralists, but also sort of the other direction as you described. So thanks so much for that. So now we're going to quickly shift to where each panelist will have the opportunity to ask a question, and I think just to another panelist, so the first four on the first panel. And I think just to make it simple, we'll just start with the order for the presentation. So Dr. Garnett, if you have any question, and of course it's perfectly fine if you don't, but the floor is yours.
Thank you. Obviously, there's loads of questions, but there's lots of really interesting presentations. I guess my question is really, how does one think about the role of pastoralism in the context of a population that is going to be 10 billion people, and also the needs of people in urban areas also to eat? I just would be really interested to see what role people think pastoralism plays in that context of a much larger whole.
Yeah, so just to clarify, this is supposed to be aimed at another one of the presenters,
well,
but I don't know if one of the presenters wants to take on that question.
Well, okay, I will throw that. I guess I'll throw it to Ilse. It's a question for you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you that there is a huge. There is a huge lot of pressure on pastoralism from population growth and expansion and so on. On the other hand, we must not forget that pastoralism, it's always like depicted as inefficient. It is actually the most efficient way of producing protein. Nothing else is as efficient as producing protein as pastoralism. And Kenya, Ethiopia, those countries with large pastoralist populations, they produce a multitude of, they make protein out of garbage, out of trash, out of something nobody else wants. Whereas in the intensive industrial system, there's a huge amount of protein loss because the animals are fed protein-rich diet and you get less protein out. I do think that, we need to make a concerted effort to leave space for pastoralists in as many places as possible, really. And because it also has, so it may not produce that huge mass, although even there, I'm not sure, because like Ethiopia, or Kenya, they're exporting huge amounts of live animals to feed Saudi Arabia and to feed China, I think, in the future too. So it may be a misperception that pastoralism is not, doesn't produce enough.
Thank you.
That's my quick answer. No, I sympathize.
Yeah,
I also think, where are the pastors going to go? But in India, for instance, they are so crucial for soil fertility because the soils don't take to chemical fertilizer. If we take the pastors out of the picture, I think India's soil fertility is doomed. Yeah. So we must, in my opinion, we have to raise awareness about the significance, the value of pastoralists and convince policymakers, and we have to get away from this reductionist thinking of only looking at feed input versus food output.
Thank you for that great question and answer. So then we'll just go down the list here. Dr. Komoro, did you have a question for another one of the panelists?
Just a quick one to Dr. Garnett. One of the things that you proposed is the aspect of diversification of diets. I do agree with, of course, some of the countries, this is very possible. But in the case of the low to medium income countries, where even the protein, I think one of your slides was able to show that in some of these countries, we have not even been able to reach the protein levels that are required in the diet. So I just wanted you to mention more. Is it an issue of, for example, in the global north, I think the focus should be more on food waste, but in the global south, where we have not reached those levels, I think it's an issue of looking at how can you be able to make better, efficient use of the resources we have. As I showed, we might be talking about the emission levels being high from some of these countries, but using better methodologies, we are actually able to show that the emission levels are not as high as depicted. So it's a paradox. I don't know whether you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, so there's so much to say there. First of all, I agree that the absolute priority is high-income countries with very high levels of meat and dairy consumption. Like in the UK, it's about 220 kilos of milk per person per year and 80 kilos of meat. It's a huge amount. So that is the priority. At the same time, I think in middle-income countries, we are already starting to see what is called the nutrition transition, which is a transition towards diets that are more comparable with people in high-income countries, which includes meat, but it includes also a lot of junk food. And so I think when thinking about what development really means, to what extent does one a development pathway that replicates the mistakes caused by countries in the low global north and all the health problems that are associated with that dietary transition, that needs to be avoided. I think the other thing I would say, and of course, you know your situation much, much better than I do, but that people on the very lowest of incomes, it's not only that they don't have a lot of meat to eat, they don't have a lot of anything That is, so it's about they don't have enough vegetables and fruits and legumes and nuts and all these other things, that this dietary diversification that we need. And what we desperately need is a pathway of nutrition that broadens diets, that includes some animal products, but includes all these other things as well. And how that is to be done is, of course, the really, really difficult question. But I would also say that the issue with animal products is, I think their value is micronutrients. As protein is fine, but it's the micronutrients where there is really value, but that can also be part of a dietary diversification, which you get those nutrients from plant foods as well. So it gets balanced.
Okay, thanks so much for that question. And then I think Ilse, if you have a quick one, we're getting a little short on time, so we'll try to make it brief.
Yeah, actually, I have my question is for Tara. I didn't, your slides were very fast, but I think I saw, one of your slides, you said only 1% of livestock products are from only grazing systems. Is it? Did you?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's very, very hard to get.
You're muted.
I'm not. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
That slide is the data are really hard to get, but that is roughly speaking, broadly speaking, the world gets most of its protein from plant foods, so grains, staples, that kind of thing. When you look at ruminant livestock, including in mixed systems, you're going to get, the proportion is going to go higher. But also that 1%, 1 gram of protein figure masks the fact that it's, as you point out, as everyone on the panel has pointed out, it's disproportionately important for pastoral peoples. So that's a global aggregate picture, not the localized picture.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And then Josephat, did you have a quick question for our panelists as well?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Tara that there is one researcher from Ethiopia who actually done research on reducing the number of animals in the particular given area, and he found that land started to turn into desert because of in absence of that animal. So don't you see that reducing number of animals is going to cause the same problem?
Again, I mean, I think that particular example and that particular context, I can't comment on that. Overgrazing at a global level is certainly a problem, and I think, as you pointed out so well in your presentation, that we have these really, really conflicting needs for land, and it's land for grazing and land for the kind of the value of pastoralism that I totally acknowledge, and then land for crop production, which of course we also need, and then of course land for nature and for wildlife. And of course these things interact. You can have pastoral land that is also good for wildlife. But I do think, and that's something that I just wanted to flag up, that we have got species extinction now. The number of ruminants on the planet is an order of magnitude higher than the number of wild ruminants. And this loss of biodiversity is something that needs to be taken really seriously. How does it happen when, in the same case, there are people needing to survive and needing their livelihoods? We know that that's a difficult question, a difficult negotiation, but I think it's I think at an aggregate level, overgrazing is an issue. There are management approaches, as you pointed out, which is about the timing and the intensity of livestock that can help mitigate that. but I don't think that in all cases, I think that in many cases, a reduction in livestock numbers is going to be part of the solution. And that's going to be true in a country like the UK, for example.
All right, thank you so much, panelists. I'm gonna pass it along to my colleague Ariel here, and we'll go along with the next panel, and then we'll save some questions for the end, just in the interest of time. So thank you so much for your really fascinating and informative contributions.
Thank you so much, Evan. I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to my lovely colleagues, Lupa and Evan and Wahid, for helping organize this event, and to all the panelists. I think it's provoking some great thinking and discussion that we can return to at the end. In the interest of time, I want to now turn to start our second panel and turn to Sita Matiraru, who is a senior agribusiness specialist with the Food and Agricultural Global Practice at the World Bank, focusing on the East Asia and Pacific region. And I'm really delighted that he can join us today as they're implementing some very exciting programs across that region. And Sita will be talking about Mongolia today. And thank you so much for your time, Sita. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends and colleagues, wherever you are joining from. It was very, very enlightening and interesting conversation, the first panel, which actually tried to set the context of the overall discourse today on climate and livestock. Right? So rather than going into the macro level, I'll just try to explain how it might play out at the local level, which is at the country level. So right now, I'll be sharing with you a context of Mongolia and what are the things emerging from there. So again, nothing is cast in stone. It is an evolving dialogue within the country. So I'll just try to present those dilemmas and the issues which are coming up. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, thank you. So the presentation is about low carbon and sustainable livestock for transforming Mongolian agri-food system. So I like the way Tara set the entire context with the diets and try to, bring in the supply of diets, which is more sustainable and protein rich as the population grows and the food requirement increases, the pressure on the environment supply. But let me just try to, preface this entire discussion with the bank's commitment to the climate change. We are very committed, and our mission is to end extreme poverty and boost prosperity in a livable planet. That's a new addition which has come up in last couple of years to make it very, very upfront clear that climate change is going to be a very important global challenge, which all of us must comprehensively address. And in the global climate change action plan, the bank group has identified some 5 key areas. In the 5 key areas, agriculture, food, water, and land, very comprehensively, very importantly figure in that plan. And the way we are approaching in each country context is, in fact, in Mongolia, we did some sort of analytical work in the year 21-22, where we did agriculture public expenditure review. Largely, Mongolia is livestock. 85% of the agriculture GDP is from the livestock. So when we talk about agriculture public expenditure review, you could see it as livestock public expenditure review. We looked at the public policy analysis with the green and sustainable lens. Then we tried to look at the green agriculture profile, basically trying to capture the baseline figures. Then we looked at the institutional aspects. What are the green agriculture technologies available? Is there an inventory? What is that we are talking about? Are we talking about data and evidence, or it's only about the possibilities? Then looking at the investment plan, both from the public and private sources, and then try to put in place the MRV systems. The operational phase, it's basically about scaling up. So trying to adjust the public expenditure so that they're aligned with the climate resilience, the climate mitigation, adaptation, plus the food security agenda. Strengthening the institutions and leveraging the private capital and leveraging the climate action plans, right? So then this is basically an overview of the climate and livestock from Mongolian context. The agriculture livestock production system contribute to nearly 10 to 12% of the GDP. This comes at a very cost of depleting environmental capital. Whatever growth you are seeing in the next slide, I can try to show. It is coming at the environmental cost of environmental capital. And today, the overstocking of livestock is almost 2.3 times over the carrying capacity. The GHG emissions from the sector, you can also try to see from the livestock numbers we have now nearly touching 66 million livestock heads. And then majorly the livestock contributes to it's the greatest contributor to emissions in Mongolia context. And basically it is coming from, if you just try to see the livestock, the enteric fermentation and manure left on pastures contribute to nearly 85% of the emissions from the agriculture sector. But the country, when we talk about emissions or livestock or climate, let us try to put the context in which this entire livestock sector is working. The sector has faced extreme events and shocks affecting the entire agro-food system, the livelihoods of the people, and the food security in general, right? But for that, you need to understand that the kind of growth which we are seeing, very phenomenal. 85% of the growth is coming from the increasing numbers. And here I come back and try to say, you guys have to reduce the numbers of livestock because you need to work on the national determined contributions. So that is a paradox, especially when from the climate economics standpoint, we need to look at, how do we address the overall economic growth perspective, the food security, the livelihoods perspective, and then try to see what kind of suggestions and what kind of recommendations can be made and the policy changes can be made in the short term and in the long term, right? So this is something which is again trying to show the productivity reduction and then also desertification, which must be factored when we look at any medium-term strategy. But basically, what is driving this this challenge is one of the important factors is about the way the economics is playing out, particularly the policies and the institutions. You'll find that the farm gate prices are lower than the border prices, which in effect is also called as negative subsidy. So the farmers are actually ending up paying more, and if only they had efficient markets, perhaps they would be able to get a better bargain. So when we are talking about any recommended strategies or solutions, we also need to find out how efficient are the markets, how the market is connected globally and regionally and within the country, right? So all the three dimensions we need to look at. And what we find is there is a significant market development gap because of a huge country, very minimalistic population, but very huge animal population. So these factors discourage productivity improvement and disincentivizes herders or farmers from investing in technology and scaling, right? Now, when we talk about the trade-offs, right? I'm presuming that the food security, the livelihoods are all given part of this entire equation. But generally, the moment we talk about the policies and institutions, the trade-offs question comes, especially economists come into play like me. So I feel the opportunity we have, at least in the country like Mongolia or in the entire East Asia Pacific region, which I can try to talk about, if we can try to emphasize on the core benefits, you will find the solutions are often around good animal husbandry, animal health and welfare. So that means you can try to generate co-benefits by working on the low carbon and sustainable livestock, connecting with the competitiveness and economic growth on one side, and the one health and the public and the food security, food nutrition agenda on the other, right? So I am just trying to propose market-based solutions, because when we talk about reducing the numbers, it is not that you have one particular solution, but you need to package the solution. The moment you try to package, there is always you will have trade-offs between mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and then one would be mitigating the emissions, the other one would be contributing. I think arriving at a net package would be very, very useful. So far as the herders are concerned, just have a very efficient package of services, extension systems, and market incentives so that they focus on what they are good at, leave the entire science and the business of inventorizing and monitoring and reporting and verification through a more simpler kind of an approach. That is how we are trying to structure here. If you just try to say, have the technology packages, codify them into practices, and try to get a market benefit through a certification mechanism. And there are a good number of examples, especially in
If you can
Mongolia, when we
just
talk about,
just
noble
wrap up.
meat,
Thank you so much.
sustainable fiber, or other opportunities are there which are now having a good market. At the same time, if we are able to marry the two, the market certification and the climate and the monitoring, verification and reporting protocols, maybe we could also try to capture the markets, right? So now when we are talking about a dispersed system, and when we are talking about trade-off between the pastoral and the intensive system, I think the trade-offs have to be looked at from the cultural perspective. Why exactly the livestock is happening there? And what is the incentive? What is the culture of the people? What are the social and the livelihood mechanisms in that particular context? So my sense is the way Mongolia is looking at is trying to aggregate at different levels. While the pastoralist will stay, pastoral will be the core of the livestock system, trying to bring the semi-intensive and intensive models which are more efficient in connecting with the markets. That means part of the production would still be with the pastoralist, but the aggregation, processing and other things would be done in a more private sector oriented, intensive, semi-intensive manner, so that you can try to bring in some sort of an equilibrium. There are mechanisms which have been tried out, piloted very successfully, trying to align the culture, institutions, incentives and infrastructure. So my belief is that rather than talking about trade-offs, can we try to emphasize on co-benefits, which will be more including more parties and sectors, so that they all have the same perspective of low carbon and sustainable livestock? I stop at that. I think we'll be very happy to take questions during the discussion round. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sita. And also, thank you for bringing up the market-based solutions, cultural perspective, and emphasizing co-benefits. That was a nice addition to our discussion. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Claudia Arendt to the floor. Dr. Arendt is a senior scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute and the team leader of the Mazingria Center, an environmental research and educational facility. And again, thank you so much for offering your time to join us today. Claudia, I hand over to you.
Here. Thank you very much, Ariel. Is the presentation in presentation mode? Oh, now it should be, right?
Yeah, now it is. Now it is. It looks good.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here today. I'm going to talk about strategies to mitigate methane emissions from ruminant and low middle income countries. As a disclaimer, I have to say a lot of the work we've done was mostly mixed crop livestock systems, but the principles do apply for pastoral systems as well. We're currently collecting data from pastoral systems, but I don't have the results yet. So first I wanted to talk about the emissions from the sub-Saharan African livestock value chain. And you actually see that 70% is going to be methane, of which 65% is from enteric methane emissions and 3% from manure management. And then another big chunk of emissions is actually from manure applied to pastures, which is about 27% of nitrous oxide. This presentation is going to focus mostly on the methane emissions from the animals, because the thing is that manure emissions from pastoral systems are already very low, especially methane. They're very low methane emissions, slightly higher nitrous oxide emissions, but they're really not that high compared to the enteric and to other systems. So I wanted to talk also about the projected population growth, which is in blue for Africa. And you see that from 2010 to 2050, we're more than doubling the African population. And when you look at the red meat and milk production, protein consumption that's predicted, that is also going to increase, but it's mostly driven by that population growth. Because here on the right, you do see that we have red meat and milk protein per capita consumption for 2012, 2030, and 2050. And you see some increase, but the increase is really not that high. And just to put that in perspective, in 2012, we have a fourth of the red meat and milk protein consumption from Europe. In 2050, African people on average will still only consume a third of red meat and milk protein that's consumed in the global north. So that increase that we're going to face in demand is going to be really mostly driven by population growth. This is now an example from milk production, but it applies for meat production as well. So you see emission intensity, which is kilogram of CO2 emissions per unit of product, here milk, and you see the produced milk per cow per year. And in smallholder systems in the global south, they're in this area because they're not that highly producing. But you can rapidly reduce emission intensities actually to a somewhat comparable level to higher producing cattle, just going up to here, which 2,000 kilograms of milk per year, which is about 8 kilograms per day. And in the dairy systems in Kenya, we have about 4 in extensive systems. So it's a doubling still, but we're not looking at having cows producing 40 kilograms. That's the same for pastoral systems. So you can apply the same logic to pastoral systems. I just don't have an example for that, unfortunately, but maybe we should actually create one. This is also from data that we collected in Kenya with looking at intensive, semi-intensive, and no-graze dairy systems. And you see milk yield here on the left, and you see there's a huge variability within the system. This is mostly to show you how variable these different systems are, and you will see the same for pastoralist systems. And when you look at the emission intensity for a kilogram of fat and protein collected milk, you also see that variability. And you see that that goes down, and you have low emission intensities for these no-graze systems. But really, what this is saying is that you have to optimize within the system because these systems have huge variabilities, and we should be learning from the farmers that have low emission intensities. What are they doing different from the farmers that have high emission intensities within one system? Because we cannot say we're moving everything to no graze or like an intensive system, because we have systems in regions for a reason, and a pastoralist system is not going to be turned into an intensive system because we can't grow crops there. We can't grow all this what would be needed to feed these animals. And the best use of the land is most likely to keep these pastoral animals there. So we should just look in how can we improve the different production systems. I also wanted to talk about the mitigation adaptation strategies that have African countries did prioritize and then NDCs. And I've put it now in mitigation, but I know adaptation is a huge topic for the pastoralist systems. And the strategies that were identified was feed management, manure management, breed management, herb composition management, and silvopastoralism and animal health. And you see the priorities based on adaptation. Adaptation is different compared to mitigation, but I'm going to talk on the mitigation side here right now. I'm not going to talk about the manure management because there is not really a lot we can do on the pastoral systems, I have to say, I'm afraid. So when we look at feed management, this is based on global north data because we actually do not have enough data to make these statements about our systems, but maybe we want to look at increasing feeding level will increase the productivity and reduce emission intensity, so emissions per product. And this is based on when we actually have feed deficiencies. So we actually want to make sure that our animals are not deficient in any time and do not lose weight. We want to make sure the animals are increasing in weight all the time. So that means that during times of low forage availability, we need to come up with strategies that can help to have enough forage available for these animals to continue growing. So that means either we're working on preserving some grass or forages so we can make hay or silage from the grass, or we can also look into like maybe selling animals before the dry season starts, so we have less animals on the land and we keep enough forage for these animals there. Then we can also look at decreasing grass maturity. That means, well, we have the herders coming out and the herders may be able to like go with their herds in a pattern that may optimize grass production and optimize grazing time points for these animals. And that will also depend from each systems where you are. And then there's also the decreasing forage to concentrate ratio. It may be beneficial to give some concentrate to these animals and to think about finishing these animals in feedlots, which has been already started in some countries, because in the last period, they're just going to be grazing, growing a little bit faster, and you can finish them, they can be sold off. So that's also something that can be thought about. Other strategies that we should be exploring is breed management. So you need a suitable breed, maybe do some crossbreeding strategies, genetic improvement, and there's also possibility of breeding to reduce methane emissions. Within breed, But honestly, this is all to figure out what's the best for each system. We still need to do research. Then there are herd composition management strategies. So basically what we want to do, we want to optimize the numbers of productive animals within a herd. And we can do this by these different measures that are listed here. This is built on, I have to say, this is built on a production standpoint. I do understand that people keep cattle for different reasons, even they're not growing anymore, because they're often savings as well. And especially in countries where we have a lot of inflation, that's important. And it's, so there are different reasons to keep cattle. So we need to understand it, and maybe we need to understand what can we do to give farmers more security, and maybe finding value in selling an animal earlier than they currently consider. Then there's also what we should be exploring. Actually, we have a lot of trees within our systems. So there's silvopastoralism, but it's really not managed actively. The trees are there, but I don't think we really understand yet what are the benefits of the trees. We do know they have improved microclimate and all this, but like, the question is, do pastoralists value the trees? Do we really want the trees in the system? Do they see what they can bring on benefit? They're also like, you can either have them produce feed 4 times when there's low forage pasture availability, but they can also have some other products that can be sold to have additional income. So that, I think, is also something that should be looked at. Thing on animal health.
Just a quick reminder about time. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm finishing up. So we looked at animal health here. We actually had data on calf mortality in Kenyan beef cattle, and we saw a reduction of over 3.5 million of protein for over 3.5 million people because of calf mortality, taking into account current beef production per capita, and the reduction. So the mortality, if we could get rid of it, it would reduce emission intensity by 6%. So we actually improved the emission overall by reducing it. We also looked at cattle miscarriages in Tanzanian dairy, and we saw a loss of milk and beef for 1 million people. If we would completely reduce that to 0, okay, that's not realistic, but anyways, and reduction in animal intensity by 14% if we would not have these miscarriages. We also found high infertility problems, so these are things we want to tackle. In summary, the takeaways are production increase lead to reduced emission intensity. So we want to look in producing, increasing production within the means possible in the system, learning from other farmers. We need more data to understand what strategies are most effective. And we also need to look at farmers, what's accepted for them for strategies, and how can we work with farmers together on this, because there's no point of having a bunch of technologies on the table, but farmers don't see the value in this and will not adopt them. This commercial from myself. I'm chairing the International Greenhouse Gas and Animal Agriculture Conference in 2025 in October. If you're interested, shoot me an email. If you want to contribute, let me know. And with that, I want to thank you very much for having me here, and all our donors supporting our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's great to hear about the conference happening in, do you say 2025? What was the year of the conference?
Oh, it's next year.
Next year,
but
yeah.
I need to, it's next year, October, but we need to start advertising.
Okay, good. That's great. It's great to hear about that. Hopefully people will join. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Next, because we want to finish up so we can have some more discussion, we're going to move on to Dr. Rafael Lotira Aricio. Dr. Aricio is a senior resilience advisor at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University and has decades of experience working to support pastoralists in Karamoja, Uganda. So we're really delighted to have you here today, Dr. Aricio, and we hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ariel. Can you please assist to share my slides?
Yes, absolutely. Just give me 1 second. I'll find them. Okay.
Yeah, just as Ariel is sharing my slides, my starting point is that my presentation will not be on greenhouse gas emissions, but mainly on resilience and climate change, focusing on the Karamoja pastoralist communities in Uganda, Next slide. And I was asked to answer 3 questions. The first question is how the pastoralists describe climate change, what their perspectives are. And then the second one is what the impacts of climate change are to livelihoods and also to resilience of pastoralists. How the pastoralists are responding to climate change. And then finally say something about policy in Uganda with regard to climate resilience. Now, with regard to the first question on how the pastoralists describe climate change, pastoralist communities describe climate change in terms of the abnormal weather changes they are observing, as well as in terms of the impacts of these changes. For example, the pastoralist would say droughts have become more common and longer. A pastoralist would also say the timing of rain has changed. A pastoralist would also say we are losing many animals to droughts, for instance, as compared to before. These are just examples of how pastoralists describe climate change. However, it is important to note that they do not understand climate change in terms of why things are changing. For instance, in terms of greenhouse gases or carbon emissions. And what this one means is that this debate on greenhouse gases emissions will be a very difficult debate if you take it to the pastoralists. But I would also be very happy to hear from the audience if there is a pastoralist community that can describe climate change with regard to emission of greenhouse gases or carbon emissions. That is something that we can discuss later. And what is it in terms of impacts of climate change? With regard to things like increasing droughts, which is a manifestation of climate change, its outcomes and the impacts are clearly understood by the pastoralists. For instance, its impact on livestock-based livelihoods, which has associated impacts on food security, nutrition, and resilience, among others. However, you'll find that the pastoralist areas also experience other multiple and multi-year shocks and stresses at the same time that a drought is occurring. And what this one means is that the impacts of these other stresses and shocks would exacerbate the impact of drought or climate change. And therefore, it would mean that it would take long for pastoralists to recover or bounce back from a disaster. So what this one means is that in terms of describing the impacts of climate change, I would suggest that we don't describe them or view them in isolation, but it should be in combination with the effects of other stresses and shocks that characterize these pastoralist areas. And I would like to use some slides to illustrate the impact of climate change in combination with other stresses that characterize the pastoralist areas. Can you please move to my next slide? Now, this slide on the left is actually showing the pattern of global acute malnutrition in Karamoja over a period of 8 years. And what you can generally observe here is that global acute malnutrition is steadily increasing. And also the figures for Karamoja are way above the 6%, which is the national average in Uganda. And it is also above the 10%, which is an international nutrition emergency threshold. So that tells you a lot about what is happening in Karamoja with regard to resilience, if we can use this as nutrition as an indicator. And And we were asking ourselves what might have contributed to this. And we used some 2017 data on livestock numbers. And we were trying to examine the livestock ownership dynamics in Karamoja. And what we found out was that about 30% of the population is the one that is owning 70% of the existing livestock. That actually partly explains why we have this situation here of rising malnutrition. And this is also demonstrating a case of a skewed or increasing livestock ownership asymmetry in Karamoja. And it could also be a symptom of what we have always described as moving up, moving out transformation in the pastoralist areas, where even in situations where we have active livestock markets, there is still inequitable distribution of benefits. And also what we can see from the graph down there is that about 70% of the households are the ones that are owning less than the recommended 3.3 tropical livestock units. So actually it means there is a big problem when it comes to the pastoralist resilience, especially with regard to climate change. And surprisingly, this is happening at a time when Karamoja is receiving about 60 to 80 million, or some extent 100 million US dollars per year in donor aid. And what it would also mean is that the community adaptation strategies, programs, and policies are constrained to protect or enhance the economic value of agropastoralism in Karamoja, which in one of our studies, we valued at US dollars 444 million. That is in 2018, 2019. And how are the pastoralists responding to climate change? There are actually adaptation mechanisms that exist. But these adaptation mechanisms have been undermined or overwhelmed by certain factors. For instance, multiple and multi-year hazards, the loss of land in Karamoja to competing land uses, and also unsupportive government policies. But we have also seen some positive shifts that would enhance adaptation. One of them is we've seen in areas like Amudat, where people have started moving to keeping of camels, which are adapted to harsh conditions. We've seen a lot of collaboration between communities and government in terms of negotiating for resources. There is increased use of mobile phones to inquire about the conditions of pasture and water. And in some areas, we've seen pressure for peaceful coexistence between communities. Then the last question is about what is it that is happening at policy level with regard to climate resilience? We have a number of policies that exist, or there are also proposals. But either
we're at 8 minutes, just to let you know.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
These policies are either not fully implemented, or they are stuck somewhere, or not supportive of pastoralism. I'll give a few examples. The AU policy framework on pastoralism has not been fully implemented. The IGAD transhumance protocol has not been signed by Kenya and Uganda, and many others. So there is a dilemma when it comes to policies that are supportive of pastoralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raphael. That's wonderful. We appreciate your presentation. And now we're going to have a chance for panelists to ask each other questions. We're going to start with our first panelist, Sita, if you had a question for one other panelist. And then after we do this, we'll open the floor to questions, which Wahid, our co-organizer, will moderate. So we want to get to that point because I'm sure there's many exciting questions and important questions in the chat. So Sita, over to you. Do you have a question for one of the other panelists?
Yeah. So, no, thank you so much for giving this opportunity, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot. But last time you did ask to direct a question to one of the panelists. I think I'll take liberty to ask Claudia. I like the way you made the arguments with the available evidence and the transitions which you were suggesting about the extensive systems and intensive systems. Do we have any investment and risk analysis so that this could drive the governments to take a policy initiative or bring in resources which might be required, especially in the pastoral systems, which are not necessarily as intensive as the private sector models, right? So that's my question about investment risk analysis on the solutions which are put on the table.
Thank you very much for the question, but I'm sorry, I'm not the right person to answer that question because I'm really on the mission side. I'm a dairy cow nutritionist, but I don't know if we can throw that back to Bernard or somebody in the policy space, or if anybody else from the panelists can answer that.
Yeah, maybe Bernard, if you want to jump in just to answer that quickly, if you know.
I didn't get the question very well. Maybe you can just.
Yeah, Bernard, let me come back here. So when we talk about the emission reductions in a sector, we are taking a very sectoral and a species specific or the sector specific approach, right? But for the government, the policymakers, they have different options to achieve the emission reductions. The abatement costs are going to be different for different sectors, for different models. So have we looked at this kind of investment risk analysis for pastoral models, semi-intensive and intensive models, so that in a country context, we can try to come up with some sort of set of recommendations which are useful for the countries to act upon?
Yeah, let me just give an example of what you have done in Kenya. And I must confess, we're working very closely with Claudia and the team at ILRU. One of the things that we are actually doing is, first of all, taking the data and using it for as evidence for policy that we are coming up with. We have in the agricultural sector, we have the long-term strategy for agriculture, and we have used a lot of that kind of data for scenarios and planning of the different outcomes, yeah, with the different emission pathways. So for us, I think the evidence is very important. It is informing us. Currently, we're actually working on a regional investment called the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, where ILRI has also supported us with that kind of evidence to be able to come up with targeted emission reduction strategies, but also coupling up with the resilience aspects. So yes, the evidence is there. We have research. There can be better, of course, collaboration with the policy. We feel that there should be better collaboration, but sometimes it's an individual effort to be able to get that data and evidence and also use it in those kind of investment opportunities. And also just to look at not just the sector, it can be the enterprise, then looking at the economy wide. But the capacity is actually the biggest problem that we still have. Institutional capacity in most of our countries is still quite low, and we need to develop that as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the questions and answers. Claudia, your turn. Do you have a question that you would like to ask one of the other panelists?
So our question to Raphael is about the climate. So basically, pastoralists underneath the pressure of climate change, but then they're also under pressure of land fragmentation and pressure to become sedentary. So how is this exaggerate? I'm assuming that makes the issue for the pastoralists worse. Yeah, so I just want to have, because the circumstances under which pastoralists are expected to produce or have their livestock are very difficult, and the circumstances are changing from what they're used to manage their animals, which were also because they were going with pasture availability in the past, and they're not able to do that anymore because of land fragmentation, I think, in many areas, and also when they become sedentary. So it's, they expect it to change so much, and that's also difficult. So I just want to understand that a little bit better.
Raphael, I think that was a question for you, if you're still with us. If not, we can always come back around to it.
Sorry, was that question meant for me? I think my internet is unstable.
Oh, don't
No,
worry,
I
don't
couldn't
worry.
get it.
Okay, the question was around, there are many pressures for pastoralists, including climate change itself, climate change impacts, land fragmentation, and pressure to sedentarize. So can you just expand a little bit on those challenges faced by pastoralists? Is that a good summary, Claudia?
Yeah, I've got it. Thank you very much. That is true for Karamoja. And I would have expounded on that when I was talking about policies, but because of time, I couldn't go into the rest of the policy proposals that are actually anti-pastoralism. For instance, in Uganda now, there is a policy proposal to settle pastoralists, to sedentarize them, and to transform them into agriculturalists. And there was also a recent one, an executive order that was released that was stopping movement of pastoralists across the borders. And of course, when you talk about land, there's a lot of land pressure. I don't have the actual statistics, but in places like Karamoja, it could be that only about less than 50% of the land is reserved for pastoralists. So there's actually a lot of pressure. And the question now is, where are the priorities placed? It seems the priorities of the policymakers are different from the priorities of the pastoralists. And that is where the dilemma is. But maybe the way out of it is to try and see a way of raising the voice of the pastoralists to talk about their interests. I have been reading about a very good example of how the Maasai pastoralists of Tanzania are doing it. So could be that is one way that we can try to engage the policy makers. And we need, I think, a thorough policy dialogue on that. Thank you. I hope I have responded to that.
Thank you, Raphael. Yes, absolutely. Do you have any questions for the other panelists, Raphael? If not, we're going to move rapidly into the many really
Maybe not a question, but I would like to go straight to an interesting question that has been asked here.
Okay, great.
That Raphael, are you assuming that all pastoralists are illiterate when you say they have no idea about climate change? Some of us who are here are pastoralists. That is quite an interesting one. Of course, what we need to differentiate here is the category of pastoralists that I was talking about. Not really the educated who are in this platform. But again, I can also see some bit of misunderstanding about what I just said. Even the pastoralists who are out there in the rural areas understand climate change, but they have their own perception, which I described, that they look at it in terms of the weather, the abnormal weather patterns that they are observing. But they do not really understand it in terms of what is causing this. So what I was saying was that if you go to a pastoralist in Karamoja and have a debate on greenhouse gases emissions as a cause of climate change, how will that debate turn out? That was my question. And I suggested that the educated pastoralists who are in this forum could maybe get out there and ask the same question to their relatives who are in the pastoral setting. Thank you. Over to you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much, Raphael. Wahid, we want to hand over to you because you are our moderator for the chat, and I know you've been looking through all the questions. And because we started 10 minutes late, if it's okay for some panelists, I know some panelists need to leave, and maybe we go 10 minutes over just because we started 10 minutes late. So Wahid, go for it. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. There are so many questions, obviously, from the previous chat and this chat. I'll try to summarize some of them, and obviously most of them are not referenced at a specific panelist, so please raise your hand and answer these questions if you want. So I guess we will start with a question that Desira has asked about, that what pastoralists should do to convince the globe that pastoralism is not the culprit of climate change. So what kind of measures needs to be taken by pastoralists themselves, I guess, to deal with this bias? If anybody wants to jump in on that. Or the panelists can use the Rand Hayes option as well.
Yeah, maybe I can partly respond to that.
Yes.
That is a very good question. And it starts from whether the pastoralists themselves understand that what we are talking about in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is what is causing climate change. That is one. Then number two, when it comes to raising the voice of the pastoralists to convince the globe that greenhouse gas emissions is not the cause of climate change, I think there's a lot that has come from these presentations in terms of evidence that we just have to find a way to disseminate that to the pastoralists. And by that, and through a critical mass of voice of pastoralists, for instance, taking an example of what is happening in Tanzania among the pastoralists, I think it would be possible to get into platforms outside our local platforms, maybe at the global level, to be able to present our case as pastoralists and to defend our interests and argue some of those misconceptions from the perspective of the pastoralists. But again, using some of the evidence that some of the scientists have presented here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. Claudia, do you want to quickly comment on this as well?
I'm just like a little bit worried. We're talking about emissions and we're talking about people whose livelihood is based on cattle, and we're blaming cattle now on lives and emissions. How are we supposed to react? Like, it's your livelihood. You now telling like you shouldn't have any cattle. I'm sorry. Like, that's not a, like I'm just like right now this discussion, I find it very like, I don't know, like I think everybody can work on improving their system. And honestly, we're looking at population growth, and especially in areas, in marginal land areas, that is the food that is the highest nutrition, and people need it, and animals will need to be there to help these people to eat. I know these areas are going to get fewer and fewer people probably over the time, but we also need to maintain landscapes and whatnot. So there's different interests that needs, and like, do you want to still use these landscapes to produce something, or we're not producing anything? I find it very like, I don't know, I find the topic, if I was a pastoralist here and I'm talking and like we're saying like reducing livestock numbers and all these things, I find that very concerning. And I don't know if I even would want to listen to the discussion, because it's like you're questioning all I'm doing. So very difficult to me here to I think the topic needs to be presented in a different way and a little bit more in a constructive way, to be honest, and try to work together and making sure that the narrative is not phrased that way. Because I feel like this is what I'm hearing here. So I just want to make sure like we're talking about livelihood here. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Claudia, for bringing in that very important perspective as well. Ilsa, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I mean, basically, what Claudia said, I totally agree with that. But, you know, the problem pastoralists face is that, I mean, I'm coming back, I'm harping on that. The prevailing, you know, livestock development paradigm, it is reductionist. It just looks at greenhouse gas emissions per units of product and ignores all the other negative externalities of highly efficient livestock. So at the root of the problem is the way we're looking at it. We need, I mean, animal science needs a different paradigm. We need to work on that, be much broader and consider many more aspects, ranging from animal welfare to biodiversity to use of antimicrobials, and all these things need to be considered. We just can't go on reducing everything to greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of product.
Thank you. So that's very important as well. Tara, do you want to come in maybe briefly so that we can go to other questions as well?
I'll come in just very briefly, and I'm afraid I will actually now have to go, but I just wanted to make the point that the real problem here is the massive growth in intensive livestock production and associated consumption. And this is the focus for most of environmental concern, is the large scale growth in livestock numbers that have been made possible by fossil fuels, global transport networks, and corporate marketing and advertising. And I think we need to focus on that. We need to recognize that livestock are the problem. And I think the pastoral community and the environmental NGOs that are focusing on the need for a shift in diets towards more diverse plant-based diets are on the same side, because they have a common focus of concern. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for having me, and I'm going to have to leave now. Okay.
Thank you, Tara, for a very insightful presentation and for these responses as well. I'm going to go to the next question now, and maybe people can come on for this one. I see like a theme of technology coming in. People are asking if there is a technological intervention that we can use to utilize the gas emission into some kind of positive energy. Is that a solution? Should we look at that as well? So if anybody wants to respond to that. Maybe panelists can raise their hands and I could request you to come in. Yeah, Sitara, would you please?
Yeah, thank you. I think just following in the previous conversation, I think it is unwise to lay the blame at the doorstep of one actor when we know as a system as a whole and the entire economic system is somehow or other influenced by the human activity. It is a collective responsibility has to be taken. Now, the technologies are the solutions which can definitely mitigate and try to, bring out some solutions. That is the reason my previous question was, if we have a good cost-benefit analysis of each of the technology solutions and feasibility in the context of the production system, then perhaps we can try to mix and match some of them. So far as manure management, there are very good number of technologies in the decentralized system, in the dispersed pastoral system, and also in the intensive system. It's a question of adapting them to the local context. But again, I'll come back. It's a question of providing a technology solution relevant to a local context, looking at the cost-benefit analysis of it, and if it is viable, then it is about extension. Otherwise, go to the public sector and then try to say, this is generating public benefits, so public investments might be necessary, right? There are some very good examples are there in extensive pastoral systems or the countries where livestock plays a very dominant role in the agriculture. For example, in case when I talk about Mongolia, that is the reason I took the case of Mongolia, because you'll hardly find crops. So you don't have a trade-off, right? You don't have either or strategy. So please try to bring those kind of discourses to bring in, in this kind of discussions, so that you get a healthy balance between people who are articulating for intensive, extensive, and also crop and livestock sector competitive approaches.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Claudia, do you want to comment on this briefly as
Yeah,
well?
I just wanted to say I agree with Sita, but I think and I don't know, but you also need to have the farmers, the pastoralists brought in this discussions, because often we come up like as scientists come with some technical solutions, never talk, because the technical side, they're not social scientists, we don't talk to the pastoralists themselves, and then and even the global north, we have all these mitigation strategies. We have technologies, but nobody is adopting them because they actually are not increasing production. And we did develop these technologies without bringing the farmers along. So there needs to be integration in what we're doing and trying to work with communities. And maybe Sita, maybe your approach actually already included that all. So Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claudia, for that. I think I'm going to ask another set of questions that were quite parallel to what you just said, I guess, around should we decrease livestock and focus more on increasing productivity, which also includes like introducing other kinds of breeds that are considered to be more productive? What do panelists think about that? The idea of productivity, increasing productivity to reduce emission and livestock for that matter.
So I comment on that. So there is a point to increase productivity, but within the means that we can do it. There is no point, which has been happening, bringing Holstein cattle for like milk production, and then we have these cattle there completely underweight because they cannot be fed. They're not made for these systems. So there's an optimizing on breed that needs to be done. Currently, food demand is going to be increasing. So I do not think we are at the decreasing livestock numbers yet, even if we increase productivity. Eventually that will happen, but it's all depending on how demand is driven. And you do need, like, Africa is just not as densely populated as Europe, for example, and that's also a reason why population is still very increasing. So it's not just Africa, other countries as well. So there is a need to have higher food production, and we're not going to do that with now decreasing the animal numbers. So there's food security aspect that needs to be addressed. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bernard, do you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, it's that's an interesting statement. When you talk about productivity, what is productivity to a pastoralist? That is a question we should be asking ourselves. For a pastoralist who has an animal that has several functions. So, sometimes we take our analysis and only take a product, which is a measurement that is, applies elsewhere, not in a pastoral system. So here we have a pastoralist who is contributing to the biodiversity in that particular area, who is actually using that animal as a resilient tool. So, I mean, it's a livelihood. So what is productivity in the eyes of a pastoralist? That's one thing that we need really to understand. Because the moment we understand that, for me, is when we'll say, yes, we're increasing productivity. We have, in the ASAL or arid and semi-arid lands, an animal that is the best fit for that particular environment. So are you going to bring in a Frisian which cannot be able to survive in that area and say you're increasing productivity? It cannot work. So I think we need to look at this thing in a more holistic way, where we are looking at the total value of the animal in that particular environment, and see how we can increase the total value, not just the product, and say we are increasing productivity. I think that is the kind of direction we should be looking at.
Yes, thank you so much for that really, really interesting and important perspective on this as well. Sitara, do you want to briefly say a few words before?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think bottom line is optimizing the production system, right? So productivity is certainly going to be there. But one would also want to consider what exactly we would want to drive at. If it is about holding or otherwise increasing the incomes, by increasing the complexity, economic complexity of the value chains can help you to achieve the same kind of an outcome with reduced numbers. You're talking about holding the food security baselines, or even improving the production for meat and other things. So you could actually use the animal husbandry practices. Like, for example, in case of Mongolia, a typical animal is held for 5 years. If we can try to bring in the changes to bring it down to 3 years, that will automatically reduce the number of animals without compromising on the food security or the meat production goals. If it is about sustainable cashmere production, so then the herder would want to have cashmere as some sort of a cash flow into the household. So we need to look at what strategies would help the local pastoralists to thrive, contributing to the economy and the environment and climate together. So it's not a simple question of reducing the numbers, but reducing the numbers in the context is, again, I would want to emphasize here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to go to the next question, which is asking about the use. the use of range lands for carbon credit projects. I guess like this was not touched upon as much. It would be interesting also of meaningful carbon credit projects for pastoralist land. Should pastoralist land be used for these projects? Is it useful or is it not? If anybody would like to come on that, please.
Yeah, so I don't think honestly we have enough data, although some people think we have enough data. And maybe Bernard can comment on this more. You may know more about the Northern Rangeland Trust, which has happened in Kenya, and that has actually not been well positive received, what happened there with the carbon credits. Then there's also an opinion of people saying like, why, like, okay, it could help us to bring some money, but why should we actually, because the carbon credits in that case is just offsetting emissions from the global north. So there are people who are arguing this, why we're selling our land to like offset the polluters in the global north. If they're not reducing, they just like basically continue polluting and just give us some money to put the land. So yeah, so I think it's a very difficult topic. Also, it's only like short term, it very quickly can be re-released. And it may, like, I think we need to see the value in having carbon in the ground for other reasons than for carbon credits, because otherwise it's also not sustainable, I think. It's my opinion on this.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Rafael, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think I agree with Claudia that it's a very difficult question to answer at this point. But again, I would ask myself, why is it difficult to answer? And I would assume that it also depends on how and where we are positioned pastoralists in the whole discourse. Because pastoralists are outside the box in all that we are doing. Then again, turning all these that we are doing into practice might become difficult. And that is why at some point it's so difficult for us to answer some of these questions, whether there is a very good example that we can talk about or not, and other things. Or even related to the previous question on whether we should reduce the numbers. It's again about where do we position the pastoralists? Is the pastoralist in agreement with some of these recommendations? So overall, what I am saying is that I recommended that we as the scientists should be able to move together with the pastoralists in all that we are doing, so that at the end of the day, we could evaluate and see whether the pastoralists themselves would see value in what we are doing, rather than us moving so fast in pursuing an objective which is more related to climate change and backtracking on the objectives that the pastoralist himself has given a lot of value. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sitara, do you want to come on this as well, really briefly?
Yeah, I have a question more than an answer to this, because again, coming back to the cost benefit analysis of it, right? So if any study has been there, I would be very keen to understand by doing an X activity additional to the normal herding or improvement of productivity or value addition, how much of that is going to be coming from the carbon credit, right? And what incentive does it hold for the pastoralist? So that means the benefit sharing arrangement in that entire transaction is becoming very, very important. And I have yet to come across a good model where the benefit sharing with the pastoralist or the farmer is the core of this entire initiative, right? So long as you don't incentivize the herder or the farmer, so this might not reach the scale. You can only try to encash the previous sequestration rather than promote any fresh sequestration, unless and until you bring the livelihood incomes, or as people were mentioning about biosecurity or the reasons for livestock into the centrality of this equation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tara, and everyone for your really insightful responses. As we can see, these issues are quite complex, and we are still struggling with it as well. So maybe two more questions then. The second last question is about, so it's a group of questions which deal with the idea of just transition in terms of pastoralist contribution, how much they contribute, and how they're expected to kind of lose their livelihood as part of this reducing an emission question. So how do we ensure the kind of just transition for pastoralists then? Is there a way to do that, or what would that look like? Does anybody want to come on this as well, please?
Maybe I can make an attempt on it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I think one of the biggest challenges is when you look at just the issues around just transition, is about a trade-off. Yeah. So it means you are coming out of your way of life as a pastoralist, or you're reducing your livestock numbers to, and then there's some sort of compensation for you. One thing I want to say is that we don't have models. This is not like the energy sector where we are saying now we are transitioning to electric vehicles, or we are moving into something else and we are compensating the people producing the fossil fuels. It's a bit more different, because you're looking at an environment that yes, once you remove the animals, then what happens? Somebody said, I think it was Joseph, that there are places where you remove the animal, the biodiversity suffers. So we don't have really good models to talk about just transition in not just in pastoralism, but in the agricultural sector. So I think there needs to be more discussion on issues around just transition on that. It becomes more clearer because you're moving livelihoods, you are changing social setups. It's a very complex thing, and how to approach it, I think, then becomes very complicated. Maybe it's more of a researchable kind of area that needs to be looked at and see. I like what Sitara is saying. It's about cost benefit. So how do you benefit the social side?
Definitely.
Let's look at those models. A researchable area, I think.
Thank you so much. That's such an important response from you as well. Joseph, do you want to come on this, please?
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to say we don't need just a transition of livestock sector. To me, I recommend rebuilding our narratives toward livestock sector. Thinking of our stand, as Raphael said, where do we position ourselves in supporting the pastoralism or livestock sector? Because sometimes we see even the government doesn't show real position for themselves. That where are they standing? Are they pursuing livestock as part of the group in the community? They don't deserve maybe a whole share of budgets, a whole share in terms of natural resources like lands and so forth. So I think we really want a new narrative, creating a new narrative perspective about livestock sector. I think that could be one of the very best options for us to do that.
Thank you, Joseph, so much. Sitara, do you want to have a last comment on this, please?
Yeah, I think when I look at the transition, we may be talking about removing the animals, but not the herders, right? So still herder would be key to the entire question. So if that is the case, then I would see the just transition as a strategy which would allow more inclusion of herders in the decision making, empowering them with the resources and strengthening their accountability systems so that voice of the herders is heard, right? And also trying to put in place proactively strategies which will address the risk which generally herders are left to themselves to handle or cope, right? It could be ex ante developing the climate or extreme event strategies, right? So we could actually build in some sort of safeguards so that the herders' existing livelihoods and their growth opportunities are not limited, but only enhanced. So even when we're talking about a value chain development or maximizing the value, try to see from a herder's lens, and maximizing that would be one of the key elements. When it comes to the institutions, strengthening the local government institutions and their resources would be of great advantage to the herders at the local level. I stop at that.
Thank you, Sitara, for the really holistic response to this. I think I really want to go on and on. Having all of you here is such a privilege, but I guess considering everyone's time, I want to end on this question that has been asked by many people in the chat as well, about kind of the polarized discussion around climate change and livestock and pastoralists. How can we create more venues, more opportunities for kind of an environment where people can discuss these things, especially a place for experts like yourself to come together and discuss this issue of climate change and livestock? So what are like some of the venues, and how can we enable such an environment in like COP and other platforms? We'll start with, was it Claudia who wanted to come in on this? Oh, okay, sorry, it's Sitara. Do you want to?
Just one sentence. It is not an either or debate. Both of them might be required. Balancing their interest to the best outcome is what we should be looking at.
Yeah, thank you so much. In fact, for this, if I could please ask everybody to have like some response so that we have more discussions like this in the future as well.
So if you want me to go next, so I just want to clarify why we're focusing on livestock right now and why there's so much pressure on livestock. It's because of the methane. The methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. That means if we're reducing methane right now, it's the only thing we have with to stay within global warming of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. We need to reduce the other emissions in the long term too. But if we don't do these methane reductions right now, we will exceed the global warming predictions. And that is why such a big focus is on livestock methane, because a third of the methane emissions from human use are actually from livestock, and they are greater than from oil and gas. At least that's what the current inventory says. So that is why it's pushing so much on that, and no carbon sequestration in land, if any, is going to offset that. And I just want to put that into perspective. And the problem is, if we reach these global warmings, we reach a tipping point, and then it's even coming worse, because then the glaciers are melting, then the more methane is going to be released, and it's even getting worse. And then we're going to have even more climate change. We have even more livestock dying that actually was food at some point, but then comes nothing, and we have just wasted emissions. So I don't know the solution. I'm just trying to put the things into perspective. It's a very difficult topic because it's many people's livelihood. For pastoralists, that is their livelihood. So I think it's a very delicate discussion to be had, because it's like saying, okay, we need to reduce livestock numbers and whatnot. Like, you're just saying like, it can't work. You don't have a work job anymore. Like, I think that's where we think we need to work together and see how we can address things. And I also think our system should be allowed to be self-sustainable in food, and we shouldn't need to import food from elsewhere, because food chains can be disrupted. We saw that during COVID. So that's also an issue. And lower emission food, which may have other trade-offs in the global north, because that's often said, oh, but we're so much better in producing food than you are. Let's send us some food to you because our emissions, but then we're not looking at biodiversity, and like, it will not reach the farmers that really need that nutrition. Like, obviously there are people in the big cities which can reduce their meat consumption and so on, but I don't think that's the case in rural areas.
Yeah.
So I'm very long right now. It's a complicated issue. I don't have the answer, but there's a lot of nuances that somebody needs to look at. Now I'm turning over to other panelists.
Yes. Thank you so much, Claudia, for putting this into perspective and to actually dive deep into the complexity of this issue. So considering that complexity, what are our chances to come to the table? If I could please hear from Rafael then.
Yeah, can I say something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I think in one statement, what I would say is we need to bring the pastoralists themselves to the center of this discourse, and everything else will follow. There are examples of researchers like the Living Labs, you know, that have helped to bring out the voices of the pastoralists on an issue under, you know, under study or whatever it is. So the moment we settle the positionality issue and who else is involved, then we would be able to depolarize this debate on climate change. Thank you.
Absolutely important. Thank you so much for that. Joseph, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to top up on what Raphael said. In placing pastoral community at the center of climate action, let us also focus on the same approaches we do in agroecology, especially in addressing the issue of emissions. Let us develop emission reduction strategy by localizing the strategy into the pastoral communities, because we have different animal production system. Most of our pastoral community, as many as I said, they use free range system, all extensive system, but also we have different part of the world, they use this intensive system. So if we develop the same emission reduction strategies, is going to be less applicable, especially in pastoral community. So let us localize the emission reduction strategies to fit into the animal production system and the other livestock management practice, especially in pastoral community.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that really important point of view as well. And finally, Bernard, would you please have the final words on this?
Yeah, very briefly. I'm also a last one, so I'll be very brief. So one thing I want to say is that I negotiate on agriculture issues at the COP for Kenya, and there are some things that I've observed. One of them is something that somebody has already mentioned. The pastoralist is not at the center of these discussions, right? I was in Dubai, and when we were discussing about the agriculture and food security, and there were presentations from different interest groups. There were no pastoralists make their presentations. We need to have them make their presentations at those kind of forums. Yeah, so it's very important for us to be able to have them at the table when you're negotiating. And the reason for that is because pastoralism clearly is not understood. We need to make the people who are talking about the issues of reduction of numbers, the issues around moving from pastoralism to sedentary systems, to be able to understand the real benefits of pastoralism and why it is critical for some of these areas. So it's important. Number two, we already have forums and platforms that can be used. Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock is there. We have the ILRI as a very useful platform. It's called GLAD. I think it's Global Livestock Advocacy and Dialogue, which is talking about the issues of livestock in general. We need to bring in more issues about pastoralism into those kind of forums. African Climate Action Platform, we have all this. How can we be able to ensure that we are latching into those kind of platforms? Because they're talking about these issues at a very high level. And then finally, I think more science, policy, practice forums, where we are also bringing the pastoralist into play, so that as we are talking about the research, we are looking at data or information that is actually targeting them, not what we are doing and it's not benefiting them. So that dialogue, we need to among them. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bernard. That's such a good note to end this question and answer session. Thank you so much, everyone, for asking those amazing questions, and my apologies to all of those whose questions I could not include in this discussion, but we also would have more discussions like this in the future, where we can answer your questions as well. I'll now pass back to Lupa for your closing remarks, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, White. This was a very, very serious instrumental debate, very interesting, engaging, and really thank you to our panelists for taking their resources really to stand up and say, let's go and get knowledge. Knowledge has been a real problem for pastoralism. That's one thing we need to recognize. I've read from the chat, people saying I'm a pastoralist. Someone say urban pastoralist. So there maybe could be other type of pastoralist, urban pastoralist, rural pastoralist, and then I don't know, another type of pastoralist. Very interesting. We also have the intensive kind of pastoralist, which science mostly is focusing the research. Of course, I agree with all the points and recommendations raised, especially using different platforms to communicate pastoralism and policy issues related to them. We acknowledge all the data that you have presented, especially when it comes to science. This data is missing among the pastoral people, and especially those who are doing the practice in the field. So I would like to say thank you so much to our dear panelists. Thank you to our moderators, Ivan, Ariel, for really taking this much time to plan this event and have it happen to us all, and to engage everyone, to debate, to share knowledge, and really pass. It's a big one. Imagine having very many people attending and sharing their input, their and responding to what they are raising. It's really very key and very important. Just another thing is that this event is happening just as a pathway to the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists 2026. So we need really to ensure that we really put pastoralism at the center, as Dr. Raphael said. Also, Dr. Ben said that we create a platform, which is very key and most important for pastoralism. This forum remains open for live engagement. We have our social media forum called the World Pastoralist Forum, where many scientists are there. We will share with you our links to join this forum, where we shall keep engaging and sharing the knowledge. We shall also share the recording for this dialogue so that many people can have access to what has been talked much about this dialogue. So I thank everyone. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Wade. All the panelists, thank you so much. Plus our dear participants that have kept their time after this time round. Thank you so much. Have a blessed evening for East Africa, or evening in somewhere in America, a morning somewhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, the platform is now open. Those who still have time can now engage, yeah?
Sorry, I have to leave, but thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to take care as well. It might pass over host to someone else, but take care. Bye-bye.